Number 33. Turning into a fight for survival. As a lifelong gamer, I thought I had seen it all. I had played countless horror games, each one more terrifying than the last. But when I stumbled upon a new game called The Final Level, I knew that I was in for something different. The game was simple enough at first. You played as a character who was trapped in a dark, eerie world, trying to find a way out. But as I progressed through the levels, I realized that this was no ordinary game. The puzzles were more complex, the enemies more relentless, and then there were the glitches. Strange, inexplicable occurrences that seemed to defy the rules of the game. At first, I shrugged them off as just part of the experience. But as the glitches became more frequent and more disturbing, I began to worry that there was something more sinister at play. And then, the game seemed to take on a life of its own. I found myself in situations that seemed impossible, fighting off monsters that shouldn't have existed. And then, there were the messages, cryptic, eerie messages that seemed to be directed at me personally. It was then that I realized that I wasn't just playing a game, I was trapped in it. And if I didn't find a way out soon, I might be lost in this digital nightmare forever. But as I fought my way through the final level, I knew that I had one advantage. I was a gamer. I knew the tricks, the patterns, the ways to exploit the game's weaknesses. And so, I used my skills to my advantage, using every tool at my disposal to fight my way to the end. And then, it was over. I emerged from the game shaken but alive. But as I looked back at the screen, I knew that I would never forget the terror of the final level. It was a reminder that sometimes even the things we love the most can turn against us, becoming a fight for survival that we never expected. Number 34. Nightmare's End. I had always been a fan of horror games. There was something about the feeling of being trapped in a world of darkness and terror that I found exhilarating. But one game in particular had caught my attention, a new release called Nightmare's End. The game promised to be the most terrifying experience yet, using cutting-edge technology to immerse players in a world of horror like never before. I eagerly purchased the game and started playing. At first, it was everything I had hoped for. The graphics were stunning, the sound design was immersive, and the scares were intense. But as I played deeper into the game, something started to feel off. The world around me seemed to shift and twist, becoming more and more distorted with each passing moment. The creatures that lurked in the shadows grew more aggressive, more insistent, until it felt like they were reaching through the screen and into my world. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the game ended. I was left sitting there, my heart racing and my hands shaking, wondering what had just happened. But as I looked around my room, I realized that the terror wasn't over. The things that had been lurking in the shadows of the game had followed me out into the real world, their twisted forms lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that the game had simply gotten under my skin. But deep down, I knew the truth, that Nightmare's End was more than just a game. It was a portal to a world of terror that I could never escape. Number 35. The Abandoned Mansion. I was always a fan of horror games, but nothing could have prepared me for the experience I had with the game called The Abandoned Mansion. The game was a survival horror, set in an old, dilapidated mansion that was said to be haunted by the spirits of the former residents. The goal of the game was to find a way out of the mansion, all while avoiding the various monsters and ghosts that lurked within. At first, it was just like any other game, a way to pass the time and get lost in a fantasy world. But as I played, something began to shift. The game became more real, the sounds and images on the screen seeming to bleed into the world around me. It started with small things, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. But soon, it was impossible to tell where the game ended and reality began. Monsters from the game began to appear in my dreams, stalking me through the halls of the mansion as I tried to find a way out. And when I woke up, I could still feel their presence, as if they were watching me from the shadows. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the game couldn't possibly have any real-world effects. But as the days went on, I became more and more convinced that something was very wrong. And then one night, I woke up to find myself standing in front of my computer, the game still running on the screen. I had no memory of how I had gotten there, but as I looked around the room, I realized that everything was different. The walls were covered in vines, the air thick with the scent of decay. I knew then that the game had somehow pulled me into its world and that the only way out was to find a way to beat it. But as I navigated the maze-like halls of the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone, that something was following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the end, I did manage to escape the game, but the experience left me shaken and uncertain. I realized then that sometimes the line between reality and fantasy can blur in the most terrifying ways, and that not all games are meant to be played. Number 36. The Only Way Out. I loved playing horror games. There was something about the adrenaline rush, the fear that crept up your spine as you navigated through a dark, terrifying world. It was like being in a horror movie, but with the added thrill of being in control. But one game I played was different. It was called The Abandoned House, and it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The game was set in an old, decrepit mansion, and the objective was simple: find a way out. But as I moved through the dark, musty rooms, I began to realize that this game was more than just a simple horror story. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching my every move and changing its layout to trap me inside. The puzzles I had to solve to progress became more and more difficult, and the scares became more intense. Every time I thought I had found a way out, the game would shift, and I would find myself back where I started. Hours turned into days, and I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Was this game even beatable? Or was I trapped in this digital nightmare forever? But then something strange happened. As I played, I began to notice patterns, to understand the game's twisted logic. And slowly but surely, I began to make progress, to move deeper into the mansion's secrets. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but eventually, I found my way out of the abandoned house. As I closed the game and looked up at the world around me, I knew that I had been through something that was far more than just a simple game. It was a test of my will, my courage, and my ability to survive in a world where the only way out was to keep playing. I've always loved playing video games. It was a way to escape reality, to immerse myself in a world of adventure and excitement. But one game changed everything. It was an old, obscure title that I stumbled across in a thrift store. The cover art was faded and peeling, but there was something about it that drew me in, a sense of mystery and danger that I couldn't resist. As soon as I got home, I popped the game into my console and started playing. The graphics were dated, the controls clunky, but there was a sense of immersion that I had never experienced before. The world of the game felt real, almost alive, and I found myself becoming more and more engrossed in its story. But as the game progressed, things started to change. The environments grew darker and more sinister, the monsters more terrifying and grotesque. And then, I started to notice things, glitches in the code, strange anomalies that shouldn't have been possible. At first, I dismissed them as just part of the game. But as the glitches grew more frequent and more intense, I began to realize that something was very wrong. It wasn't long before I realized the truth. The game was alive, and it was trying to kill me. The monsters weren't just pixels on a screen. They were real, and they were coming for me. I tried to turn off the console, to shut down the game, but it was like the game had a will of its own. It refused to be stopped, refused to let me escape. In the end, it was only through sheer luck and determination that I managed to survive. I emerged from the game shaken and traumatized, with a newfound respect for the power of video games. From that day on, I was always more careful about what games I played, always mindful of the dangers that could lurk behind the pixels and code. Because in the world of gaming, the line between reality and fantasy can become blurred, and the consequences can be deadly. Number 38. Never be able to escape this virtual world. I loved video games. They were a way for me to escape the real world and immerse myself in a different reality. But one game in particular changed everything. It was a horror game, one that promised to be the scariest experience of my life. And it certainly lived up to that promise. From the moment I started playing, I was sucked into a world of darkness and terror. The game was filled with jump scares and gruesome scenes, and every time I turned a corner, I never knew what I was going to find. I found myself playing for hours on end, unable to tear myself away from the screen. But as the game progressed, things started to feel off. The jump scares began to feel too real. The darkness seemed to seep out of the screen and into my room, and then I started to hear things. Whispers, footsteps, even breathing. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I started having nightmares about the game, seeing the monsters and horrors in my dreams even when I wasn't playing. Eventually, I decided I had to stop playing the game. But even when I uninstalled it from my computer, the feeling of dread lingered. It was as if the game had seeped into my reality, leaving a shadow of terror that I couldn't shake. To this day, I don't know what it was about that game that affected me so deeply, but I do know that the consequences of playing it were all too real, and I'll never look at video games in quite the same way again. Number 39. The dream was not merely a dream. I loved horror games. The way they made my heart race and my palms sweat, the sense of danger lurking around every corner. But when I discovered a new game that promised to be the most terrifying experience yet, I knew I had to try it. The game was called The Maze, and it was like nothing I had ever played before. It was set in an abandoned maze, and the objective was simple: find your way out alive. But the catch was that the maze was full of traps, obstacles, and terrifying creatures that lurked in the shadows. As I played, I felt my heart rate increase with each step I took. The atmosphere was so intense that I could feel the sweat pouring down my face, but I couldn't stop playing. The thrill of the game was too addictive. But then something strange happened. As I turned a corner, I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just part of the game, a scare tactic to make me jump. But as the figure grew closer, I realized that it was real. It was a person, and they looked just as terrified as I did. We didn't exchange words. We didn't need to. We both knew that we had stumbled upon something that was far more than just a game. We were both trapped in the maze, and there was no escape. As we wandered through the maze, trying to find a way out, we encountered more and more people, all of them just as scared and lost as we were. And then we saw them, the creatures that had been haunting us in the game. Only now they were real. We ran, screaming, as the creatures chased us through the maze. It was like we had been transported into the game itself, except this time there was no reset button. There was no escaping the horror that we had unleashed. In the end, we were all lost in the maze, trapped forever in a game that had become all too real. And as I sat there, in the darkness of the maze, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. The thrill of the game, the rush of adrenaline, because now it seemed the game had won. Number 40. Sometimes it's not just a game. I've always been a big fan of horror games. There's something about the thrill of being scared that I find irresistible. The adrenaline rush, the feeling of being on the edge of my seat. So when I heard about the latest game to hit the market, I knew I had to play it. The reviews were glowing, calling it the scariest game ever made. I couldn't resist. As soon as I started playing, I knew that the reviews were right. The game was terrifying. Every turn, every corner held a new horror, a new terror to face. But I kept going, driven by the need to see what was next, to push myself to the limit. But as I played, something strange began to happen. I started to notice things, small, subtle changes in my surroundings that I couldn't explain. A painting that had been hanging on the wall was suddenly gone. A door that had been closed was now open. At first, I thought it was just part of the game, a clever trick to make it even scarier. But as the changes grew more frequent, I began to realize that something else was going on. The game had taken on a life of its own, bleeding into the real world. It was no longer just a game. It was something far more sinister, something that I couldn't control. As I played on, the terror grew, until I felt as if I was being watched, as if something was waiting for me just beyond the screen. And then, suddenly, the game crashed. The screen went black, and I was left staring at my own reflection. I thought it was over, that I had escaped the horror of the game. But as I looked into the mirror, I realized that the terror had only just begun. For staring back at me was something that should not have been there, something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let it in.